Alright, so doing an oil change on the Raptor today. It is a 2019, so it has the metal oil pan, and that means I was able to install a Fumoto drain valve during my last oil change. So this is going to be my first time doing it with the valve on. Obviously the first thing you're going to want to do is warm up the oil so that it drains easier. This is actually necessary. You're going to have to do this. So just drive around the block, get the engine warmed up, get the oil warmed up. Make sure that you do drive around and not just idle the engine. You're going to want to make sure that all the oil gets splashing around and warmed up. I do have a small lift on the truck using iBox springs, but even without the lift, as long as you're not using a creeper, you will be able to do the oil change without needing these ramps. I ended up using the Rhino ramps just so that I'll have a lot of extra space and that I can get the light underneath there and make sure that I can get the best visibility possible for the video. I've used these ramps before with several other vehicles. I never actually looked at the weight rating until this one because I was a little concerned. The weight rating on these is 12,000 pounds for your gross vehicle weight, which the Raptor is well underneath. I put it in 4A just to make sure that the front wheels were actually pulling onto the ramps and not just pushing it with the rear tires. I try to be as safe as possible whenever I'm working on the truck, so I put some wheel chocks behind the vehicle, and I ended up putting some jack stands underneath the lower control arms just to make sure in case the vehicle shifted for whatever reason. My driveway isn't isn't completely level. It does slope down slightly, so I just wanted to make sure that everything was as safe as possible by adding the jack stands. You'll see me do a few things during this video and use a few tools that you don't actually need to use, and I did it just for the video. Again, the light source, I had a few different light sources trying to make sure that I could get the best video possible. And I pulled off a few extra pans or trays underneath the vehicle, the underbody protection, just so I could get a better view and clean everything up as best as I could. This isn't the first oil change that I've done on the vehicle. I try to change it about every 5,000 miles or less to make sure I'm not burning any oil up. And I have previously used different types of oil and different types of filters. This time I'm going with the Amsoil oil and just the OE filter. I have the impact wrench here because I'm going to be pulling off the entire front skid plate. Absolutely not necessary. There is a panel that you can pull off on this skid plate which enables you to reach the oil filter. It's specifically there for an oil change. But I wanted to make sure, again, that I got the best video, and I wanted to be able to see things as clearly as possible and have extra arm room to pull that oil filter off because it is difficult to see and difficult to get to. Here you can see that oil change panel that you can pull off. It uses a Torx bit. I am pulling off the entire skid plate though, which is 13 millimeter in the front for the front 4 bolts and then 15 in the rear for these 2 rear bolts. You'll notice a pretty big gaping hole right there. That is where your OEM intercooler is supposed to be. I do have a front mount intercooler that I've replaced it with. So you're not going to have all of that extra space if you don't have that intercooler. To get to the drain plug or the drain valve, there's another smaller panel right here that you need to pull off. It does have 3 bolts on it. They're 10 millimeter. And it takes a minute, but you can pull those right off. With the light, it's a lot easier to see the drain valve. I did get the nipple one, the short nipple one, and I did attach a vinyl clear hose to it in order to drain the oil very quickly. I cut the length specifically so that I could feed it down into the drain pan, but unfortunately because I had it up on the Rhino ramps, it didn't reach. So I actually had to hold the hose while the oil was draining. The Fumoto valve has a little safety clip on it. It's blue. Make sure that you don't lose that because you will need to secure it again to ensure that that valve doesn't open up while you're driving or with any shaking or anything like that. I did remember right before opening up the valve that I wanted to pull off the oil cap on the top just to make sure that there was no vacuum in the system and that the oil could drain as best as possible. When you're ready to drain the oil, there is a little lever that you have to lift up and then rotate, and the oil will start coming right out. Again, because the hose wasn't long enough, I did have to hold it for a little while until the hose was pliable enough that it stayed straight down. And that's because the oil was warm. It actually warmed up the hose and allowed me to let go of it. And then after letting it go for a little while, I let it drain for about 15 minutes and came back to close everything back up. Whenever I came back, I made sure to put some gloves on. I forget to do this all the time, and I end up doing things with my bare hands, and it kind of pisses my wife off. So whenever I remember, I make sure to use some gloves when working on the car. Something that you don't see me wearing right now is eye protection, and I think it's incredibly important to do that. Make sure that you're wearing eye pro underneath the vehicle so nothing falls in your eyes. For the valve, again, rotate the lever back into its position, put the blue safety clip back on. I tried to shake out all the excess oil and the thing popped off. I recommend that if you buy a Fumoto valve that you buy the long nipple and not the short nipple, because that'll make sure that you can actually keep a hose on there all the time, or at least it's easier for the hose to stay on there if you want to add it on later during the oil change. With everything sealed back up, you can go ahead and put that panel back on, again with the 3 bolts, 10 millimeter. I don't actually own an adjustable oil filter wrench. I do need to look at purchasing one. I'm used to BMWs, and most of them require a bolt to be removed and a paper filter installed in a housing instead of these external filters. So I did end up buying this this one filter wrench for use with this vehicle, but it doesn't actually fit with the OE filter, only this aftermarket one. So it was helpful with taking it off, but I mean, whenever you're putting it on, you want to do it hand tight anyway. So with the current location of the oil filter, it is very difficult to get some purchase on it, some good grip, just because there's a lot of things in the way. And you can imagine that if I didn't have the intercooler removed, and I didn't have the entire front skid plate off, it'd be even more difficult just to reach up there and actually get a good grip on it. I have tried it from above previously, and it's definitely easier from below, but it's still just difficult, period. The way that the oil drains out from this filter location is pretty silly. You have to have several oil pans in order to catch all of the oil, because it drains out from 3 or 4 different locations. You'll see that it is right above a cross member, and there's a plastic tray on top of the cross member that the oil drains into, and then it drains into the skid plates underneath, and those skid plates have holes where the oil drains out of. So it's absolutely ridiculous how this is set up. I have looked into getting a relocation kit where you can locate the oil filter kind of wherever you want, but I can't really imagine that is good for using off-road. So I haven't done that yet. I haven't figured out a good place that I would want to put it if I did do it. You don't need to pull off this pan. I'm pulling it off just to get a better look and to do it as clean as possible. Because the oil drains into the skid plates, and then the skid plates have holes in them, you end up with a ton of oil on the skid plates, and either you have to figure out a way to throw your hand up there and wipe everything down, or you can pull the entire pan off. So there's not necessarily a good way to do this. So just for the video, I decided to pull the entire pan off. There are 4 bolts remaining on this skid plate. 2 went to the skid plate in the front, and then you have 4 more in the rear. The 2 larger ones are 13 millimeter, and the smaller ones are actually different sizes. The one on the driver's side is going to be 10 millimeter, and the one on the passenger side is 12 millimeter. Once I got the pan off, I was able to see how much oil was actually in the pan. You'll see there's quite a bit. If you don't clean this up, you might end up thinking that you have a leak in your vehicle. You know, as you're driving or in your driveway, you might end up seeing a few spots of oil and think that there's a leak, but it's actually just remaining oil on the skid plate. The oil filter is installed horizontally, so unfortunately you can't do, you know, the old trick wherever you install some fresh oil inside of the filter, and then that eliminates any loss of pressure in the system. You can't really do that here. I was a little too lazy to hop up and grab fresh oil to lubricate the seal, so I just used some old oil and rotated that on, cleaned everything up as good as possible, and then, you know, tightened down the oil filter hand tight. It does give you directions on the oil filter, so you know exactly how far past hand tight you need to do it. I think it's another 360 degrees you rotate it. Here I'm cleaning up all the excess oil that fell down on the differential and on the steering rack. Now that everything is cleaned up, you can go ahead and start reinstalling all of those panels. So just do the reverse. Installing the front skid plate is always fun just because you've got to figure out how to get it up there. It's a little easier whenever the truck is on the ground. Whenever it's up higher, I had to use my knee to adjust everything. You have everything kind of has to line up. You have the skid plate, and then you have the skid plate that's behind it. You also have a metal bracket, and a very long 15mm bolt goes through all of those in the rear. And in the front you have these four. I've actually only recently owned an impact driver, the electric one, but I will tell you that it's definitely don't rely on them. Once you use them, make sure that you torque it down by hand, and that's whatever you're using. If you're working on your wheels, make sure that you torque those down by hand with an actual torque wrench, or if you're working on the skid plates, make sure that you torque them down yourself by hand also. Like I said, I did decide to go with the Amsoil oil this time. This is going to be the first time I've used the Amsoil oil, the 5W30. I'm not a fanboy or anything. I think I've seen a lot of people on forums say that like Amsoil is the best, and they do have a lot of research and published papers discussing their oil and how it's so much better than everything else. But I don't know. I just decided to give it a shot this time. I think next time I'll use it also, and then I'll try and source the actual Amsoil filter as well, just to make sure everything matches up. Every single time that I change the oil on any vehicle, I think that I remember how to do it, and I remember the capacity, and that's not always true. In fact, I think I rarely remember the capacity. I did know that I had to get 6 quarts, so I got the 6 quarts, and then on the last one, just because I wasn't sure if there was any oil left in the engine, I decided to only put in half of the quart, and then check it later. I got a little scared because I wasn't sure what the actual capacity was, and I didn't want to have to find my cell phone, so I looked in the manual just to make sure that I had the correct fluid amount specifically for the Raptor and the high output 3.5, and it was exactly 6 quarts. So I went ahead and added in, just because I didn't want it to be too low, I added in almost the rest of the quart and started it up. It's always a good thing to leave your vehicle running. Make sure that you get it on a fairly flat surface before you start checking the levels. Again, depending on the vehicle that you have, you either check the oil when it's running or you check it when it's turned off. With the Ford, you check it when it's turned off. I haven't had an actual dipstick in a long time. I'm kind of used to the electronic sensors, so I felt kind of silly. I kept checking it over and over again because I was wiping up oil as I was pulling out the dipstick. But eventually, I pulled it out cleanly and was able to notice that it had right about the mid-range of the appropriate amount. So I just added in the last of the oil and called it a day. I hope this video was helpful for anyone who's looking at doing the oil change on their own vehicle. I try to save as much video as I could, going from the outside of the vehicle into this, the tight spaces, just so you'd have a good reference point for where everything's at and how everything goes together. So hopefully this was helpful, and thank you for watching.